They were the children of the civil rights movement, born in the shadow of its victories and the glare of its unfinished business. They were the first generation of Black Americans to grow up with the legal right to walk through any door, yet they learned early on that some doors remained harder to open than others. This is the story of Generation X, the often overlooked middle child of modern Black America. Born between the mid-really transformative 1960s and the early 1980s, pretty wild times, right? Black Gen Zers grew up in a world undergoing a seismic shift. The ink was barely dry on the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, and the promise of integration was being tested in real time. Unlike their baby boomer parents, who fought for these rights, and the millennials who would inherit them as a given, Gen X was the proving ground. They were bused to newly integrated schools, often facing hostility and isolation. They were the children of a burgeoning Black middle class, moving into suburbs where they were frequently the only family of color on the block. This was a generation defined by a quiet, persistent navigation of two worlds. Life was a study in contrasts. On television, they saw aspirational images of Black success on shows like The Cosby Show and A Different World. But on the nightly news, and just outside their doors, a different reality was taking hold. The 1980s brought the devastating crack cocaine epidemic, which tore through urban communities with a ferocity that reshaped the very fabric of life. For many Black Gen X youth, the daily commute to school became a gauntlet of potential dangers, from gang violence to aggressive policing spurred by the nascent war on drugs. There was a palpable sense that your world could be upended in an instant. This constant, low-level hum of anxiety bred a fierce self-reliance and a cynical pragmatism that would become a hallmark of their character. This daily reality fostered a unique resilience, a blend of street smarts and book smarts. You learned to code switch not as a social strategy, but as a survival mechanism. You could discuss Shakespeare in the classroom and then navigate the complex social codes of the neighborhood basketball court an hour later. This was the Walkman generation, curating their own soundtracks to a life of contrasts, with headphones that provided both an escape and a shield. This deep-seated independence is a stark contrast to today, where hyper-parenting and constant digital connectivity shape the youth experience. The dangers were different then, more immediate, more physical, requiring a situational awareness that today's digital natives, whose threats are often virtual, may not have needed to develop in the same way. The divide between generations becomes clearest when we look at their foundational beliefs. Black Gen Xers were raised with the mantra that they had to be twice as good to get half as far, a direct inheritance from their parents' struggles. They pursued stability, valuing a good job, homeownership, and a pension plan as the ultimate markers of success. They saw the system as something to be cautiously navigated and, if possible, mastered from within. Conversely, the generations that followed, Millennials and Gen Z, grew up with a different set of tools and expectations. They inherited the language of social justice and wield the power of social media to demand systemic change with a boldness that can seem jarring to their Gen X elders, where Gen X sought to integrate and succeed within existing structures. Younger generations are more inclined to question and dismantle those structures altogether. Their activism is public, digital, and collective, a departure from the more individualistic and often quiet pragmatism of the generation that came before them. In the end, Black Gen X stands as a bridge. They translated the dreams of the civil rights generation into tangible, everyday realities, laying the groundwork for the world their children would inherit. They are the quiet architects of modern Black life, shaped by the analog dangers of their youth and the digital dawn of a new century. They are not as loud as the boomers or as visible as the millennials, but their impact is etched into the very foundation of the present. They learn to survive, to adapt, and to build a life on their own terms, creating a legacy not of revolution, but of profound and enduring resilience. Before the internet, before hashtags, before the world was connected by a click, there was a generation caught in the crosscurrents of history. They were born after the dream of the civil rights movement, but grew up in the shadow of its unfinished promises. This is the story of Generation X. Black America's latchkey kids, navigators of a world that both feared and fetishized them. Growing up black in America during the era broadly defined as Generation X from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s was to inherit a complex legacy. The legislative victories of the civil rights era had pried open doors, but the hallways beyond were often fraught with new, insidious dangers. For millions, daily life was a tightrope walk, a constant negotiation of risk. The threat wasn't just the lingering specter of overt racism. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of the cities and suburbs they called home. The crack cocaine epidemic, which exploded in the mid-1980s, was not merely a public health crisis. It was an invading force that turned neighborhoods into war zones. The ensuing war on drugs responded not with treatment, but with militarized policing and punitive legislation, disproportionately targeting black communities. For a black Gen X child, the dangers were a part of the daily commute. Walking to school could mean navigating turf lines drawn by gangs, avoiding police stop and frisk encounters that presumed guilt, or simply absorbing the ambient tension of a community under siege. The soundtrack of their youth was a duality, the revolutionary beats of Public Enemy and New chronicling their reality on one hand, and the incessant wail of sirens on the other. This was the generation of the latchkey kid, often raised in single-parent households as economic pressures, exacerbated by deindustrialization, forced parents to work longer hours. They learned independence not as a virtue to be taught, but as a condition for survival. They mastered the art of reading a room, of knowing which streets to avoid after dark, and of presenting a carefully constructed exterior to navigate a world that often saw them as a threat. Compared to today, life then was lived in a different dimension of risk. While today's black youth face the viral danger of police brutality captured on smartphones, black Gen Xers faced a more analog, yet equally pervasive threat. It was the danger of disappearing into a prison system swollen by mandatory minimums, the danger of being a statistic in a homicide rate that peaked in the early 1990s, the danger of a stray bullet from a conflict they had no part in. The battles were fought block by block, often in silence, without the national megaphone of social media to amplify their cries for justice. The fear was less about being filmed in a moment of injustice and more about that injustice happening in the shadows, unrecorded and unacknowledged by the wider world. This lived experience forged a profound difference between Black Gen X and the generations that followed, Millennials and Gen Z, while facing their own monumental struggles with systemic racism, have grown up with a vocabulary and a digital toolkit that their predecessors lacked. They can organize a protest with a tweet crowdfund for a victim's family and broadcast injustice to a global audience in seconds. For Black Gen X, activism was more localized, conducted through community meetings, flyers, and word of mouth. The skepticism and pragmatism often associated with Gen X are not just personality traits. They are the hardened calluses of a generation that saw the promises of the 60s curdle into the paranoia of the 80s. They were taught to keep their heads down, work twice as hard for half as much, and navigate broken systems rather than expect to dismantle them overnight. Ultimately, the story of Black Gen X is one of profound resilience. They were the bridge generation, standing between the seismic shifts of the civil rights movement and the digital revolution of the new millennium. They absorbed the shocks, navigated the dangers, and translated the blues of their parents into the hip-hop that would define a culture for the entire world. They learned to survive in the shadows so that future generations might have a fighting chance to live in the light. Their journey, etched in the rhythms of a boombox and the realities of a fractured American dream, remains a crucial, powerful chapter in the ongoing story of Black life in America.